Good evening, girls. Um, this is my eighth class. This one I have recorded and uploaded today. And before I begin, I would like to make it clear to you that you are always again welcome to come up with your queries, even if it is not a live class. So we will begin from where we had left off the last day, of course, because this class is a continuation of the last class. So after talking about the representation of the natives in the novel, we were talking about the deciphering the consciousness of the author himself, that is Kipling, and how his own consciousness or subconsciousness forms a split within his own mind, very much like the object or the other. And we were reading an extract. We read an extract from his autobiography, and in his autobiography elsewhere, he had at various times he had mentioned about the darkness which was both within his mind, which was again a metaphor and a continued conceit, if I can put it like that, a continued conceit, a metaphysical conceit, if you will, for the symbol that it stood for, also the geographic and the unexplored locations and unexplored darkness of the locality of conquered lands or the colonized or the uncolonized world. So the darkness stood as a link or a chain between the darkness within his mind and also with the geographic and threatening darkness of the uncolonized world. And this analogy between the darkness in his mind and of the uncolonized world is part of the underlying philosophical structure that permitted or sanctioned the conquest of the earth. As I was giving you the metaphor of the Enlightenment movement and what it meant uh, for the colonizing project, for the project of imperialism, rather, because that was the philosophy that was that formed the pillars upon which the foundation of the imperialist project was laid and built, uh, to enlighten the mind, to enlighten the lands which are so-called inferior or so-called dark or unknown or unexplored or uncolonized, and they need to be acquired, they need to be civilized and made according to us. So in the process, Rudyard Kipling, as a person himself, as a person, as a human being, he was also split within his own mind. Thus, for Kipling, for Kipling, as for colonial ideology, journeys into the psychic interiors or into alien cultural or political interiors, both the interiors which is unexplored and dark, the interior of the mind, the psychic interiors, and also and also the interiors of the uncolonized lands, which are yet to be seen and yet to be gazed upon, yet to be written about, recorded, yet to be recorded. So, for Kipling, and as for the colonial ideology, journeys into the psychic interiors or into the alien cultural or political interiors, they suggest, both of them, this suggests the desperate need to control the uncontrollable. Both Kipling's desperate need to control his darkened mind and also to control his objects, or those who have been objectified by the greater system to which he belongs, or the greater system of which he is a unique representative. So it is both these journeys into the psychic interiors and into the political interiors of the uncolonized world. They suggest the desperation of his need to control the uncontrollable, and also the desperation of the empire's need to control the uncontrollable and to confront in writing the troubling contradictions necessary and necessary failures of efforts to govern the self and its empires. So, our colonial discourse analysis will include both of these analysis, that is, to judge, to gauge rather, to look upon closely, to dissect, to deconstruct and reconstruct through the author's writing the troubling contradictions, the conflicts, and necessary failures of efforts to govern the self and its empires. Both from Kipling's end and from the empire's end, because they are overlapping, they are superimposed on each other, Kipling and the empire. So, as by colonial discourse analysis, we deconstruct both the psychic interiors and the cultural or political interiors which are alien, which are yet to be colonized, yet to be controlled. So, that is why it is necessary for us to involve certain other perspectives into this Orientalist approach that we have been taking, and of course we will continue to take. So, let's see. Yes. So, as you can see on your screen, you will see that I have quoted an introduction to a collection of Kipling's early newspaper sketches, which he used to do as a profession. He used to sketch in newspapers. And look at what the editor says. So, after you have read this, the ideas that you get are quite contrary to what Kipling thought of himself or about himself. Kipling was not then, nor was he later, a public supporter of the liberal reforms in India. Liberal reforms, we are coming to that. Alternatively, exhilarated and frustrated. Kipling was alternatively exhilarated and frustrated. He was divided between allegiances to home, to work, and the nighttime Lahore which he loved. But his nightly insomnia also produced fertile wanderings through the alleys of Lahore that in turn provoked his earliest stories told by narrators who had access to both Indian worlds. So he used to do this. He was an insomniac, and he used to roam around the streets of Lahore, and it gave him it produced some fertile narrations, some narrations of wanderings, some narrations which were informed by his wanderings among the nighttime Lahore, in the nighttime Lahore. Um, and they are presented in his earlier stories, in which he included narrators who had access to both Indian worlds. His nighttime narrators appropriated stories of the other, and sometimes the voice of the other, a strategy that necessarily reminds us of the later appropriations of European imperialism, but with a difference. So, yes, as I was saying, so his nighttime narrators, they narrators, that is, in his earliest work, in his early works I'm talking about, the narrators in those works, they appropriated stories of the other with a capital O, and sometimes the voice of the other. Now, this we know why these voices of the others are included, but there is a difference over here. Kipling's narrator sometimes enters into, I'm sorry, yes, Kipling's narrators, they sometimes enter into a dialogue with the native, and the native storyteller, the native who is also narrating his own stories, and they are in a dialogue, the native telling his or her stories, and the narrator telling his story. The narrator, who is none other than the psyche, the represented psyche of Kipling himself. So there was a dialogue between between both of them within the works of Kipling, and thus here we have an attempt to bridge the gap between the colonizer and the colonized through language, and the collapse and the eventual collapse of radical difference into a common materiality, because they are wandering in the streets of Lahore, and they are conversing with each other in mutual coexistence. That is the common materiality which both of them share: the subject and the object, the colonizer and the colonized, the self and the other. The problem of the other in Kipling is therefore not a simple alterity outside the self, as we have learned according to Freudian analysis, or according to Freudian psychoanalysis. We have learned that the other is which is not the self. Other is defined by a lack. But here, with the problem of the other in Kipling, is not a simple alterity where we can say that the other is outside the self, because we have the concept of the other as borrowed or as innovated from Freud's concept, of course, but borrowed from Freud's concept and innovated and extended in its variations by Jacques Lacan. He was also a psychoanalyst, and Lacan shows us his writings. They only come out in the form of transcripts of the seminars he gives. So that's why I said that Lacan teaches us that the other is the first object of his desire. That is Kipling's desire. The other is the first object of Kipling's or the self's desire. Like all other European knowledge of human society and construction of history itself, Kipling's dominant stance is often from the vantage point of a Western eye that stereotypes, categorizes, and universalizes absolute knowledge about the Orient and its Orientals. This is because of the desire for the other, that the self, which is the colonizer, which is the subject, which is Kipling, his dominant stance is more often than not from the vantage point of a Western eye that is always stereotyping, categorizing, and making homogeneous, universalizing absolute knowledge about the Orient and the Orientals. But the difference is here that Kipling also sees the West from the vantage point of the internalized other, the underground Indian child who is always and unavoidably within him. Kipling, who has lived in India, Kipling, who was born in India. That Kipling, and the Kipling who is a gazer with a Western eye, stereotyping Western eye, they are both together one person. And here we differ from the Freudian concept of the other who is outside of the self. Here, Kipling, the self, also includes the other within him. This is what we call ambivalence in colonial discourse analysis. Ambivalence which occurs in the mind of the colonizer. Kipling being one of the primary and one of the best examples that can be provided of an ambivalent mind, that he includes the other within himself. And I'm sorry, just one moment. Yes, and here that you see, I have quoted over here a quote from the book Kipling's Mind and Art by Noel Annan. It is edited by Andrew Rutherford, and there it is written that there was a picture in the work of Kipling, of course, in the art of Kipling, there is a picture of a society which politically, nervously, physically, and spiritually quivered on the edge of a precipice. That is, if we talk about India, India was quivering on the edge of the precipice. That is, something big was about to happen, an event that was going to happen very soon, which was going to change a lot of uh, a lot of things, a lot of ways which were normal and conventional at that point of time. A lot of things. India was a hotbed of rising revolution at that point of time, and therefore he uses the word precipice over here. Now, what is this precipice that we are talking about? The result of the contradictory packaging, the very conflicting package that India was at that point of time post mutiny. Mutiny, that is the Sepoy mutiny of 1857, mutiny from the perspective of the colonizer, of course. So this precipice, or the potential, the event that had the potential to change the present conditions at that point of time. That precipice was in part, it was a result of what the nation had become post the Sepoy mutiny of 1857. There was a reassessment of the real, that is the British or the colonizers or the empire trying to control the heterogeneous, multifaceted culture of India, of the colonized, the empire trying to control this uncontrolled country, the uncontrollable natives, so-called uncontrollable natives. The empire employing various methods, ideological control by force, by coercing, various methods they are using, and it is producing an effect. So it is the desire of the empire, the desire of what Kipling represents, the desire of the self, the superior, to control the other, that creates the real in Lacanian terms. Of course, I am contextualizing to Kipling's novel, to the context of Kipling's novel. That is the real, that is the desire of the self to create, to how should I put it, to recreate, to reinvent, to reconstruct according to personal motives the other, to reconstruct the other according to itself or himself, according to the empire's ideologies, according to Kipling's ideologies. That is the real, with all its effects and consequences, that starts with the desire of the self. So that precipice was in part a result of the of the country of the country of India, which was which was undergoing a reassessment of its real conditions, real as charged with the Lacanian meaning, of course, as I just explained, with the real conditions as they were, rather than the imagined, which for Lacan, of course, I'm talking about Lacan over here, Lacan's terms, these are the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. They are all Lacan's terms. So they're a reassessment of what was actually happening at that point of time, which sprung forth as a result of the desire for the other, of the self, and for the other, that caused the real with all its effects and consequences, rather than the imagined, which is the idealized or the imagined real, or the imagined conditions, the imagined, the conditions that are imagined by the British, that everything is all right, that everything is okay, that we have controlled them, that we have defeated the mutinous soldiers, the mutinous Indian soldiers, and that everything is in control. But it is not, because that is what power, any form of power, will always reassure by reinstating, repeating the very falsified fact, repeating the ideology that everything is okay, but everything is not. You can contextualize this very same situation in contemporary times as well, where we are always told that everything is fine, nothing has happened, but actually too many things have happened, which has made this real conditions which sprung forth, which began with the first and foremost desire of power, desire of the self to control the other, to control the uncontrollable population of the country. So this precipice which I just spoke about in the last slide, it was a part of the result of this conflict that India was undergoing post mutiny, post the 1857 mutiny, which was the real conditions, a real condition of the country, real according to Lacan's psychoanalytic terminology. And the relationship between the government and the people of India. And in part, if we wish to, if you wish to use Lacan's terms, anxiety, which I just showed in the previous slide, um, yes, as I was talking about an anxiety that Zoret T. Sullivan notes, as you can see over here, that Zoret T. Sullivan notes a lack of anxiety in the above views. So if I am talking about Lacan, or if I am relating to Lacan's terminology or his ideas, then anxiety is a means, this anxiety is a means to approach a lack, a continual and perpetual loss. Or anxiety may be related to the lack which is also entrapment or confinement. Lack is also being confined, as lack is derived from the, as anxiety is derived from the word angst, which means narrow. And and also this lack is also the verb, which is to lack of breath. Anxiety is perhaps when what one feels when the world reveals itself to be caught up in the space between two frames, which Kipling was exactly in a position that he was caught between two worlds, and that was giving him the sense of confinement, the sense of perpetual loss, the sense of lacking breath. That is what anxiety, that is what lack means according to Lacan. That Kipling here is feeling that the world is revealing to him itself to be caught up in a space between two frames, a doubled frame, or one that is split. So that is the split ambivalent nature of the colonizer that we are talking about over here. And it is often this anxiety of the marginal, repressed voice and the unsaid in Kipling's early works and stories that energizes them, that he includes the voices of the other, which he internalizes, which he does not exclude from his self, but according to Lacanian philosophy, he internalizes this loss which is the other. And what he leaves unsaid, it concerns the turbulent politics of the 1880s, as I just said, post-mutiny. There was a turbulent time because, as you must have heard about Alan Octavian Hume, A.O. Hume. So by the late 19th century, by the late 1880s, Hume had once again begun agitating. He had begun agitating for native rights and for a parliamentary government. And to achieve this, he wrote various letters to every graduate of Calcutta University asking for 50 volunteers to begin a movement for the regeneration of their country. And 1884 was the year that Lord Ripon acknowledged that the most important problem in British India was the emergence of a new class of Western educated Indians. And the Ilbert Bill was a bill that was passed that prohibited or restricted the employment of Indians to government civil services. It did not restrict it through it meant to mobilize this law that Indians will be equally allowed for civil services, but it was a failure. The bill was a complete failure, and it was the failure of the Ilbert Bill that provoked educated Indians into acknowledging the inadequacy, the insufficiency of kind intention of the empire, of the British, to secure results, in spite of the intercession of such caring and committed English officials as Allen Octavian Hume. So only the kind intention was not enough, as the newly educated social class of India was acknowledging, even if there were people like A.O. Hume who really wanted to make a change. And Hume was a controversial figure who was trusted by both educated Indians and English officials. Until his ideas for Indian reform, they grew too radical and troubled by his failures on behalf of the natives. And his pamphlets in the 1880s brought upon him the wrath of the officials who thought he aimed at becoming the Indian Parnell. Kipling was also accused of a similar thing. Kipling was also accused of a similar thing as empathizing or sympathizing with the natives too much. But Hume's commitment to this cause, which galvanized the Indian resistance at that point of time, and it made prominent the leadership of W.C. Banerjee, G.S. Iyer, and P. Mehta, among others, it resulted in the first Indian National Conference and the birth of the Indian National Congress. This was happening when Kipling was writing or composing his earliest stories. So he was influenced by this local color of that point of time, the struggle that was going on. People from his own race who were standing up to the atrocities of the British Empire for the Indian natives. Kipling's early fiction records this struggle with representing the voice and landscape of India at a time when bureaucracy at Shimla and state repression were so severe that officials feared an unprecedented cross-class revolutionary outbreak. And Kipling's early fiction, it records this struggle, records his struggle with representing so varied voices, so many various voices. And if Kipling's Indian fiction ignores the realities of the rise of Indian nationalism and the existence of men like A.O. Hume, it refracts its material reality. It refracts its material reality and helps construct the ways in which colonial India saw itself. And for that, Kipling is a creator of history. So, girls, what the lesson that we gain after what I just said, I'm you saying we because it applies to the both of us. It's because it is not because only because the syllabus states under DSE Unit 8, DSE Unit 8, 7, that the following texts are to be read in context of the Orientalist approach and how these texts reflect the sentiment of the post-colonial ideology of new readers, etc., etc. It is not that we should make ourselves fall into a very narrow labyrinth of limited interpretations and limited perspectives. The fact that Kipling was not a thoroughgoing racist, was not a thoroughgoing imperialist propagandist, the fact that he included the voices of the natives within his novels, no matter its underlying function, no matter its underlying purpose. Because we are deconstructing them, so we are doing our job. As long as we are doing it, as long as scholars, post-colonial scholars are doing it, as long as we are reacting against what Kipling made permanent, it is all right. It is there in its own place. The process is undergoing its way. Decolonizing as a process is on its way. But the fact that he includes these voices trying to represent the actual political struggle that was going on in that point of time, that is what is also important while doing post-colonial critique. Because if we are sure of the fact that recording of voices has an underlying political agenda, then we cannot be sure of the fact entirely that that is the only function that it served for the author. The author might be genuinely interested in observing, in taking down what he saw through an imaginary language. It was his way of representing India. It was his way of representing the struggle, the political struggle that was going on in India. It was his way of representing the conflict between the real and the imagined ideal superior status of the empire, of the self, of Kipling's own consciousness, and the real traumatic experience, the real traumatic relationships with the other that the self had at the point of time, the real traumatic and turbulent relationship that the empire had with the natives, that Kipling's own consciousness, Kipling's own self had with the other, whereby as an artist, as an author, as a creative writer, he imbibed the sentiment of the other within himself, and what flowed through him, what he represented in his novels, was nothing but an accurate pastiche of the conflict that was going on inside his own mind and also outside. So no longer is the other a separate from the self. Here we have the self that has enmeshed itself with the other, the ambivalent subject. And this ambivalent subjectivity is reinforced from the facts that we can gather from his letters, such as this. This is an extract from one of his letters that he had written to a friend of his. We can see here that the split that occurs in his mind here between the I who hunts, rummages in and loves the physical India, like the Mowgli that we have in the Jungle Book. The split here between the I who hunts, rummages in and loves the physical India, and the you who departs for Fleet Street reflects more than a convention, Kipling's division between his Indian night self that had to be abandoned on the streets of India and his English day self that in fact did depart eventually. But the strength of the letter writer's voice reflects the strength of his resistance to the Fleet Street self, which, refusing to be silenced, haunts the voices of his other narrators, and sometimes his other narrower, writerly self that judges and categorizes Indians as if they were nothing but specimens marked for the London Ethnological Society to be observed, that is. So, what I mean is that through these letters, which we know that according to epistolary convention, of course, is a slow revelation of a symbolic revelation of one's mind, writing letters, that is. But this is more than that. Here, when I see that, if I told you that I look forward to nothing but an Indian journalist's career, why should I? My home's out here, my people are out here, all the friends I know are out here, and all the interests I have are out here. Why should I go home? I am deeply interested in the queer ways and works of the people of the land. I hunt and rummage among them, knowing Lahore city, that wonderful, dirty, mysterious anthill, blindfold and wandering through it like Harun al-Rashid in search of strange things. I am in love with the country and would sooner write about her than anything else. So, this is the I, the first point of division from his own self, from his self, that he wants to abandon, because this I, it loves the physical India, because it loves the dirty, mysterious anthill that Lahore city was or is. So Kipling's self wants to abandon this idea of this I, the I which loves India, and wants to embrace the I that wants to come to Fleet Street and die. The you who goes to Fleet Street, who loves Fleet Street. So the conflict is between the I that loves India and the you who goes to Fleet Street, the self and the other. Here we see that you to Fleet Street and I to my own place, where I find heat and smells of oil and spices and puffs of temple incense and sweat and darkness and dirt and lust and cruelty, and above all things wonderful and fascinating, innumerable. So this is Kipling talking to his own self, that you, the other brother in my mind, you go to Fleet Street and let me be here in India, which is above all wonderful and fascinating. And the strength of the letter writer's voice, it reflects the strength of his resistance to the Fleet Street self. He does not want to go to the Fleet Street. Here the self, the I that loves India, wants to make itself superior. That is also the struggle that is going on within him. A struggle for superiority within his own mind. The struggle for which is again in extension represented by the empire's attempt to colonize. And it resists this Fleet Street self, which refuses to be silenced, and haunts the voices of his other narrators, the native narrators or the semi-native narrators that he creates or invents in his stories. This self, this I, who rummages in the nighttime Lahore, who loves India with all its dirt and dust and lust, etc., etc. This self haunts the voices of his other narrators, and sometimes his other, which also means narrow, his other narrower writerly self. Writerly means that which is from the perspective of the reader, not the writer. Writerly means from the perspective of the reader. So this self, this I, it sometimes haunts the voices of his narrower writerly self, that judges and categorizes Indians as if they were specimens marked for the London Ethnological Society, which actually did happen at that point of time. If you see the way that Civil and Military Gazette at that point of time defined the city of evil countenances, as you can see the meaning, the name of the essay, that the main road teems with magnificent scoundrels and handsome ruffians, all giving the onlooker the impression of wild beasts. Who is the onlooker? It is nothing but the white superior self, the white superior colonizer, the empire, all giving the onlooker the impression of wild beasts held back from murder and violence. And this is their project, that we need to control you savages, you barbarians, and hold you back from killing each other, from committing murder and violence, and chafing against the restraint. And in very similar manners, we also find the languages of his characters and his narrators, who seem to be living a tense life on the borders of someone else's thought, someone else's consciousness. Now here we need to take a quick detour. We need to pause for a bit over here and introduce another theoretical concept which is very important in this context. The fact that Mikhail Bakhtin says that the other narrators of Kipling seem to live a tense life on the borders of someone else's consciousness. Someone else means, of course, by now we know that the other narrators of his stories, they are none other than a representative split, an ambivalent self of Kipling himself. And that is why Bakhtin says that the other narrators, they seem to be living a tense life on the borders of someone else's thought, someone else's consciousness. Here we pause for a bit and talk about Mikhail Bakhtin. So let us just pause over here and take into consideration what Mikhail Bakhtin is actually talking about. Just one moment. Yes, what Mikhail Bakhtin is talking about. So here we have a new name again of Bakhtin. So Mikhail Bakhtin was a Russian thinker, and whose works appeared in English decades after he wrote them in the 1920s and 1930s. And he proposed dialogue as an intrinsic feature of language. While Bakhtin himself never used the term dialogism, it has been associated with his work, the term dialogism, and is the most recognizable concept from his oeuvre, from his own niche. In order to understand his work on the novel, that is narrative, since we are gathered over here to discuss about a realist novel, it is important to look at his notions of dialogue. There are a few key terms in Bakhtinian thought that have to be understood, namely dialogue, heteroglossia, chronotope, and carnival. I will be engaging with only two of these topics and sending you a very summarily assessed views of Bakhtin. It is from a book book written by Pramod K. Nair, Contemporary Literary and Cultural Theory. So I will be sending you a PDF of Bakhtin and dialogism, a part of this book, for those who do not possess this book, for your help. So let us see. So the first is the dialogue. The dialogue is a differential relation, and dialogue always implies a relationship. That is the relationship that exists there between the self and the other, between the empire and the native, the real relationship. But what is relationship? In any conversation, the speakers are different from each other, right? But what is interesting is that these differences are retained in the conversation. They are held in place in the relation, which is the dialogue. Dialogue is imposed upon us. We do not set out to engage in dialogue. Dialogue, therefore, is a concept that gestures at mutual difference at the heart of all conversation. It asks us to pay attention to relations in language. Bakhtin believed that the existence of mutual difference enables dialogue. He was therefore focusing on the self-other aspect of all knowledge, where there is always the other within my speech. In fact, my speech anticipates and prepares for the other's response. His focus was entirely upon utterance, what is uttered within the narrative of the novel, which takes place between two speakers, and they are located in a similar context, in a similar social conditions. The speakers, they assume that their values are shared by the others. The speaker, the self, assumes that its own standing is to be replicated, or is to be adopted, or is to be adopted to perfection by the other as well, the audience. Dialogue is the central feature of all speech. What Bakhtin essentially does, and very importantly, is that he situates the novel as an intrinsic mesh of these dialogic relationships, the novel as a genre. And says that meaning in any utterance, meaning that is signification in any uttered language, is based on the social context. The next concept that you see is heteroglossia, which is the existence of many levels of dialogue simultaneously, not one after the other, but simultaneously. It is a horizontal relationship, not a hierarchical or vertical relationship. It exists, all of these dialogue that we just learned about, it exists on a very simultaneously. That is, we find the dialogue between the self and the other, between Kim and the other natives, between Kim and Lama, between among the natives, between police officers, between the babus of the 19th century India. So all of these that are existing simultaneously. And since it is actually impossible to systematize, to organize the mass and variety of languages, because of the sheer heterogeneity, the other's voice is given as much importance as the voice of the self. And in case of the novel, Bakhtin here analyzes Dostoevsky's novel primarily. And in case of the novel, the many voices are given equal importance. That is how we get the chink in the armor of the colonial discourse, and we get to criticize it, we get to critically view it. We become the onlookers here. The tables are turned, and we are the ones who are gazing at this imperial discourse, because it gives space to the voice of the other with equal importance, thereby showing the novel as a site of struggle, subversion, and the carnivalesque, the carnival that you see here. So the heteroglossia is firstly they are such as in a novel produced by suppose a philosopher who is capitalist in nature, who is right wing in his political views. He includes the dialogue and conversations of the working class people. So we have the working class discourses within a realist novel. We have women's language, the language of ethnic minorities, racially marginalized minorities, all that are included in the novel. The narrative structure of the novel is so that it has to give equal importance and build a horizontal relationship between the various levels of dialogue that exists. Dialogue as a word that is charged with the meaning that I just spoke about, or which you see in your screen, very briefly put. Bakhtin's one of the most important and most interesting concept that he introduces to us is the concept of the carnival or the carnivalesque. Since the novel becomes a site of struggle, conflict, which we also saw how it exists in the novel from Kipling, the conflict, what struggle, what conflict there exists, on how many levels it exists, and it all exists on a similar plane of the novel Kim. And the fact that Kim, as a realist novel, in its narrative records the voices of the other, it records the slums, the descriptions of the slums, of the crowded bazaars, of the dirt, of the corrupted babus, of the corrupted British individuals, of the turbulent and very traumatic relationship that existed between the British Empire, the colonizer, and the colonized. That it records the that it records the it records in a very descriptive fashion the nature and the consciousness of various characters within the novel, all presented with equal care and all presented with equally descriptive language, as necessary, of course. Uh, this provides the novel a very powerful position to construct the carnivalesque, that which is gross, the ugly, the grotesque, the laughter, all of the aspects which the so-called hitherto superior self had ostracized, had marginalized, had otherized. And since this is the Lacanian other that we talk about, the anxiety that we are talking about, we know that the self, that is Kipling, has internalized the other. And therefore, the product that we have as a conflict within his own mind that he tries to represent in his novel, the result that we have is an internalized other, which is the carnivalesque, which is not devoid of the carnivalesque, it's not devoid of the grotesque, is not devoid of the laughter, of the ugly, which in Victorian novels you will never find. In other European Victorian novels, you would never find in a Jane Austen novel a prostitute being described with equal care as perhaps Elizabeth was described in Pride and Prejudice. That is never the case. In a realist, in a novel which includes the dialogic, in a novel which includes the carnivalesque, and in a novel which acquires so much prominence that it has turned scholars from the stringent and rigid view that this is a racist critique on India of the 19th century to the view that Kipling perhaps presented the authentic Orientalist view with the internalized other. It is because that Kim as a novel has preserved the carnivalesque. And therefore we see that the other narrators, it is always slipping out of the authors, the narrators, and readers' urge to control, and sliding towards doubt and self-contradiction. His characteristic willingness, the narrator's characteristic willingness to leave a story open, incomplete, and gasping for resolution is precisely the mechanism that puts the reader into action, that puts us into action, that compels us to question the ambivalence, to construct or create out the ambivalent character of the self, of the author, of the narrator. And we wonder where we stop in the process of reading the story's schizophrenic splitting of itself between the oppositional skepticism and imperial faith. The split that is between the skepticism of the empire to actually absorb the objects as one of their own and make them subjects after civilizing them. They're skeptical of the fact, right? They are skeptical of accepting the aping Indian, the mimicking Indian as one of their own. So this is the split between this oppositional skepticism and the imperial faith. And his great triumph, which he chooses to attribute as his personal demon, personal daimon, which is a concept of W.B. Yeats again. So we will talk about this briefly, perhaps in the later class. However, his greatest triumph, Kipling's greatest triumph, is the fact that he remembers it over 50 years later. Over 50 years later, he remembers this. And he writes in his autobiography, Something of Myself, that he has the ability to think in another man's skin. That thought does not compel him towards identification, but leaves him, his narrator, and his reader in a dialogic relationship with the character, able to feel the particularity and the importance of the other's voice, yet he is distant enough to situate that voice in a larger, multiple, and different cultural context. So this is where we stop for today. And of course, as I just mentioned, you are free to approach me with any questions or queries that you might have. We will continue our class next week. Thank you very much. Bye bye.